A couple of weeks ago, Ubisoft invited me to play Star Wars Outlaws early. I was put up at a nice hotel and even got to check out the Star Wars side of Disneyland with some other creators, but the real star of the show was getting to play around 4 hours of Star Wars Outlaws. And if you are familiar, this game's a pretty big deal, particularly for fans of this channel, as this is the first ever open world Star Wars game. And this hands-on was the perfect hands-on. I got to play the game for 4 hours, one 3-hour session, and then a final hour, but during this entire thing, I had no restrictions on what I could or couldn't do, and I even got to keep all of the gameplay footage from my play session. Yeah, this is me actually playing the game in the background, unless you see me playing really badly or missing a bunch of shots, in which case that probably isn't me. And going into this one, I think I had a pretty unique perspective. I'm not a huge fan of Star Wars per se, but I am a massive fan of open world games. And just right off the bat, several aspects of Star Wars Outlaws completely blew me away. The game definitely didn't deliver everywhere, but if you do like open world games, or even just kind of like Star Wars, I think this will be one of those must-buy games for you because open world Star Wars truly is an incredibly unique experience. So first, let's just talk about what open world Star Wars actually plays like. Jumping into my first 3-hour session, you are positioned pretty early into the game. Having just crashed on a planet named Toshara, you already have your blaster, some key objectives, and even get your first speeder. The overarching objective being to fix our ship, and yeah, even from this moment, you could just jump on your speeder and start cruising around this planet. The speeder itself is a ton of fun. This very much so has that GTA effect where you can probably spend a good few hours just messing around in the open world, and yeah, I did exactly that. I was taking jumps with the speeder, finding all kinds of animal herds or even other NPCs using speeders of their own, and just kind of going about their day, and really just taking in some of these stunning sights of this landscape. We will talk more about the visuals a bit later on, but I was only really exploring like this on one planet, and I still have several moments where I had to stop to just take it all in. I have to imagine this is an experience many of you will want to have on several different planets in Star Wars Outlaws. But of course, there are also some more open world focused activities for you to find. Some of these will trigger as you're moving, kind of like a random encounter you can stumble upon. At one point, someone pops on dispatch mentioning stolen supplies and how an Imperial assault team is going to take them back. Lo and behold, an Imperial ship is landing nearby and a full fight breaks out between them and some of the nearby pirates, and you now have a limited time objective to steal the supplies and likely take down the Imperials for yourself.
I won't even notice if some of those supplies go missing.
Open fire! Understood. My platoon and I were once pinned down by artillery on Yakaru.
At another point, some homesteaders were under attack from pirates, and I could cruise over to help fend off that initial attack, or even several more waves that came after. This too just seemed to be a random limited time event to pop up, but you could also find random treasure in the open world. This is funny because it does pop up on your screen, alerting to you that, hey, there's treasure nearby, go look for it. And this could be something as simple as some loot in a pit to a far more hands-on mini obstacle course that have what I would consider some fantastic views at the end. As well as even just some little Imperial terminal stations. It's basically like a small guard post that you can hack to gain some credits for yourself. And even this is a pretty specific experience. I'm really only able to speak to the open world on this one planet of Toshara. But overall, I got the impression that there were a variety of open world activities that you can get while adventuring on, but then separately quest lines that will take you all over the world to specific locations. That's to say, I wasn't really finding all that much substantial in my aimless open world exploration. Like yeah, you'd have these cool moments when these limited time events would pop up, but Star Wars Outlaws was not like a Bethesda game where you end up with 15 miscellaneous or side quests. At least for me in Toshana, I really didn't get many quests by all of this exploration. I just found random things and could look at them or interact with them briefly. The open world does have territories, so you can go into specific Empire territory or even other faction controlled areas, but this didn't really seem to have a massive impact on gameplay. Like here, for this entire clip, you've been watching me explore around a bunch of Empire territory. It wasn't that notable or different, but there are also going to be 2 other types of open areas for you to explore as well, as both space and cities have the same factor. The main city in Toshana was Mirogana Valley, and this place was quite large. Upon walking up, you have complete access to the city with restrictions. So basically you'll find that you can walk everywhere, but some places will have things like guards. You can technically fight them to just get in, but you won't be able to survive realistically. So in effect, you're locked out of this section of the city until you get to that quest that brings you here. But other than that, the city and even the other city I explored later on during my playtest was almost fully open. You could freely wander and explore, and this was perhaps the coolest part of my hands-on experience. I'm not a huge Star Wars fan personally, but what I discovered is that Star Wars has a really cool aesthetic. Walking through this bazaar, even past some of these Imperial patrols, things just look good, but also pretty cool. You'd find NPCs just standing around cooking, tons of robot parts splayed about, and some of the visuals on individual assets looked absolutely stunning here. These robots almost look better than some of the robot CGI from the prequels. And even some of the stormtroopers, while in armor, looked absolutely phenomenal at times. More than once, I stopped and was just like, damn, that person looks great. There are animals just hanging out, and yes, you can pet some of the animals if you'd like to, which is a very handy feature to have. And even some more specific things, like horse racing, which you yourself can get involved in and bet on are here too. And there was a degree of magic here. Just getting to take a step back and watch some of these Star Wars characters go about their day and do things was incredibly enjoyable. Even for me, as a non-Star Wars fan, because I feel like the aesthetic of this franchise is just really pretty. It has a cool art style and a lot of cool designs. The details here were seriously impressive from a visual perspective, but there honestly wasn't a ton of interactivity. This isn't Red Dead Redemption, where you're gonna have a bunch of miscellaneous interactions like that. Because unfortunately, after spending a fairly large amount of time just looking at things, you start to realize that there isn't really a ton to find in this open world. Like yeah, it looks cool, and to see people going about their day or even finding an R2-D2 like robot just moving around is pretty awesome, but I wasn't finding many treasures or new quests in the back corners of cities, and honestly, I barely found anything of note when wandering around like this. Like yeah, there's some vendors that you can trade with, but other than that, it's largely just cool set dressing. And at points, it is particularly cool, but most of the actual content is going to be delivered during quests. That's not to say it's nothing. You can find intel, which can lead to various quests. Sometimes even just overhearing a conversation can lead to something, but in my roughly 4 hours of gameplay, of which I spent way too much time just wandering around, I probably only found like 3 of these. The open world space aspects are more of an unknown to me. Over the course of my time on Toshana, I did eventually get my ship back and working again, and even in the second play session, you do begin in space with a spaceship, but I didn't spend a ton of time with this aspect of the game. From what I could tell, ship flight was very freeform. You just fly around and maneuver freely, and there was some serious potential here. This is the #1 thing I want to know more about right now. How freely can you just explore space and actually go to different planets to find things? And one thing Star Wars Outlaws gets right is planet entry. This is exactly what Starfield needed. Basically, as you approach a planet, you'll have the option to land, and it'll transition to a hidden load screen. So right here during this, I can fully control my ship, roll it around, go up and down, but there isn't actually anything to do. I'm on a fixed on-rail path. I can just move my ship around the screen if I want to. In the background, the planet is loading. It's basically like giving your brother the disconnected controller and letting them play. But just like your brother, I think I'm doing something, so it felt fun, but in reality, it's just a hidden load screen and a transition to this cutscene where you actually see yourself landing. I am very well versed with the Starfield landing loads at this point, but this version from Star Wars Outlaws is a million times better. It probably doesn't feel that way watching it on camera because you can't actually feel it, but having played through this a few times during my play session, I found this far more enjoyable compared to what we have as Starfield, although obviously not quite as good as what you have in No Man's Sky. And overall, when it came to the open world, this seems like it was laid out fairly similarly to other Ubisoft games. They give you access to the open world pretty early on, but there's a fair amount you can't do without progressing the story. For example, sometimes you'd need some blaster attachment to get through a certain area, or these guards will just shoot you on sight and are too high of a level for you to get past them. But overall, I really like this. I didn't encounter any invisible barriers, but instead I was shown why I can't do something just yet. And it did make the overall exploration feel a lot more enjoyable, because this open world does feel very open, even if there wasn't necessarily a ton to find. The bulk of your actual gameplay in Star Wars Outlaws will be around questing. The story takes place in between the events of The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, which likely means a lot more to many of you than it does to me. You play as this character Kay, who is basically Han Solo, but different, and you even have your trusty companion with Nix. Nix is actually voiced by the same person to voice Commander Cody, as well as many other characters, so fun fact. And the real crux of the story in Star Wars Outlaws are around crime syndicates. There are several crime syndicates, and from what I can tell, these will act as the backbone of questing, and will seemingly be one of your major choices that consistently comes up as you play through the game. They're effectively the different factions in the game, and some of the ones I encountered are people like the Hutts, Pike, or even the Crimson Dawn. So oftentimes, as you're doing a quest, it'll involve one syndicate or another, but you'll also have choices that can benefit one syndicate or another. So you go through this quest, get a valuable piece of information, and you'll have the option to share it with the Hutts or Crimson Dawn. Whoever you choose will get a reputation increase as your standing with them evolves, and whoever you don't choose may have no change to reputation or even have their reputation go down as you may now be hurting them with that information. And reputation does matter because this will allow you to unlock new things such as blaster parts or other valuables for your character. There's actually a whole array of upgrades you can apply to K, although I really didn't dive all that deeply into it. So over time you'll likely develop feelings and start partnering with one syndicate more than some of the others. And right at the bat, the game introduces you into this idea that there will be a constant ebb and flow here. You will constantly be angering one syndicate or another while playing. At least it seems like most players will play that way. And you can see this made very clear in game. It really seems like this flow of choices and who you help will be a major aspect of the experience and really your decision making. It kind of felt like at the end or at some point during almost every major quest, you'll have some big decision to make around the syndicates and how you're going to impact them. And as far as the story quality, it was honestly hard to tell. The quests were fun and interesting, particularly this one where you're escaping an Empire ship I found to be a really enjoyable quest. But thus far in the story, I felt pretty neutral. It was interesting enough, but I wasn't absolutely hooked after a few hours with this story. It definitely felt like one of those games where it would be carried by the open world gameplay as opposed to an award-winning story, at least based off my limited experience thus far. There is this lockpicking minigame which people will have strong opinions on. You basically have to hit the trigger as this sound is played. So it's a game of timing based off an audio cue. You have to get the timing just right, basically like playing Guitar Hero to open this lock. I found this really frustrating at first, partially because I sucked at it, and I have to imagine many gamers out there will hate this because they're bad. But once you do get the lockpicking down, it feels absolutely amazing. Like just rolling up and getting the lock open first try makes you feel so good. And by the end of my play session, I found this to be one of the most satisfying lockpicking minigames I've pretty much ever experienced in a video game. Although thankfully, there is a menu option to just disable this, so if you never want to deal with the lockpicking minigame, you don't have to from day one. But also how you approach quests does have a bit of flexibility. And this part of the game honestly reminded me a bit of Cyberpunk 2077, where you have this general go stealthy or go loud approach to the various quests. A fair amount of the gameplay was sneaking into syndicate bases to steal something, and you would be faced with several different ways to enter. It's not like there's one path and no other options, but instead you actually have, okay, you can jump through this air duct or try and distract these guards and sneak around them. Star Wars Outlaws definitely had a quest focus. Some quests required stealth outright, but in general, many quests pushed you towards stealth or even non-direct combat, so you'd be able to take down enemies from afar or without other enemies noticing. But one of the nice parts was it definitely felt like there was multiple avenues even if you decide to go the stealth route. It's not like you were just limited to one specific path even still. But yeah, some of those quests where you just fail if you get detected do feel bad. I hate that aspect of video games, and it did not feel nice in this one. As separately, there are also some quests where an alarm trigger will cause failure. So you can play this hybrid of stealth and combat. Just make sure nobody touches that damn alarm, and you can make as much noise as you'd like. I personally much preferred this approach, even if I did still fail several times. And overall, it did feel like there was a fair amount of flexibility as to how to approach some of these various quests, which was nice. I definitely appreciated that, and it felt like you did have a good degree of choice. But when it comes to questing overall, this felt very similar to other Ubisoft games. The big choices around syndicates is a nice mix-up, and I think for a lot of players, this will elevate things just enough to make this game far more interesting than some of the other options out there. Although, one of the other aspects of this story was it's very cutscene heavy. For many of the quests, you would go do something and then walk up to someone towards the middle or the end, and for that interaction, it would be a full-fledged cutscene where you're just kind of watching everything happen. Some of these are pretty long, being a minute or even several minutes long, and this isn't necessarily a good or bad thing, but it definitely is a thing. This game has a fair amount of cutscenes, although you are able to skip these. But of course, if you skip the cutscene, you're basically just cutting out major chunks of the story. As well as during some of the quests, you can explore around and find some extra goodies, definitely more so than in the open world. During one quest, I found some horse race tips, so I knew which horse would win this next first race, and I ended up placing a max bet and winning a decent amount of credits. But then we also do have the combat of Star Wars Outlaws. And this was a pretty unique aspect of this game, because Star Wars Outlaws combat almost feels like it's just one-handed. You get this blaster, and this is your main weapon for the entire game, but over time, and even via some quests or siding with certain syndicates, you can upgrade your blaster to have more functionality. So in my second gameplay session, my blaster had a secondary stun feature in addition to its primary fire. I could switch between those two fire types. The stun feature was better against robots as well as people using shields. But there's also several other functions here. You can use a Deadeye mode to take down several enemies. A guaranteed stun shot that does have a longer cooldown, and seemingly more things will unlock as you progress. But also Nyx is a major part of this. Nyx can fetch stuff for you, but far more impactful. Nyx can also attack and distract enemies. The combat here is pretty interesting. The time to kill in Star Wars Outlaws is pretty low, so both you as well as other enemies will die in just a few shots, and I personally enjoyed that aspect of things. Combat had consequences, and yeah, at points you could avoid stealth or ignore the stealth aspects altogether, but it definitely felt like that made the game harder than just being a bit more patient in stealth. Taking down enemies, a lot of times with the Empire in particular, they can drop their rifles and you can pick those up, or perhaps even pick up heavier weapons that can be dropped. And you'll basically be able to use that weapon until it runs out of ammo, then you have to switch back to your regular blaster. And since the time to kill is so low in this game, getting something that's fully auto makes you feel way more powerful. These pickup weapons felt amazing, and genuinely like a huge power surge for your character, which led to a lot of fun. And overall, I'm kind of undecided on the combat of Star Wars Outlaws right now. A lot of the times while I was playing, the combat felt a bit clunky, just having that one pistol and then rolling around trying to avoid enemies. But then there was a few moments where I would combo things together quite well, like use my stun or use some of those blaster attacks, comboing it with Nyx or even a heavy weapon, and it all just came together perfectly. I was seriously impressed by how satisfying some of the individual moments felt, and it made me wonder if I was approaching combat wrong, if instead you should really treat this as a combo game, where you want to take down enemies in quick succession as fast as possible, and I think in that regard, this could end up being a lot of fun and a very enjoyable combat. But other times, I felt like I was just sitting there with my blaster against one too many enemies, and things weren't super enjoyable. The combat just felt fine, like a pretty typical open world action game. But one thing I did notice is having just one weapon didn't really bother me all that much. I could see a lot of people looking at that and being like, ooh, that sounds bad, but the blaster had enough functionality that it kept things fresh and interesting even over several hours. And the combat AI was definitely fairly stupid at points. It was pretty easy to get around some of these guards or even just do takedowns right in front of other guards. And when it comes to my overall thoughts and experience with Star Wars Outlaws, I will say I am generally very excited for this game. At its core, this feels like an open world Ubisoft game that just so happens to be Star Wars. But I think it has enough going right for it that if you like Star Wars or even just generally like open world Ubisoft games, this is definitely one to keep your eye on. It doesn't strike me like something that'll be game of the year, but I had quite a bit of fun even as a non-Star Wars fan, because I think this is a world that a lot of people can just easily get into. But even though some of that aimless exploration did feel a bit unrewarding at points, I still feel like the open world aspect of Star Wars Outlaws significantly elevates this game. Being on the way to a quest and then just being able to take a pit stop and go explore the vast unknown is still really exciting, and it still was quite a bit of fun. There has been some pushback around visuals, and I definitely noticed this somewhat during my hands-on. The game went from being completely stunning in how it looks to just a bit uncanny and almost PS2 era at other points. Sometimes it felt like the upscaler was a bit fuzzy, but honestly with this kind of stuff, it's very hard to tell with an early work in progress build. I was playing something that's likely several months before the release build, so for this aspect, I'm gonna just kind of wait and see. I'm really not sure how some of these visual concerns will shape up as we approach release. I played Star Wars Outlaws in early July, and it doesn't actually come out to the end of August, so there's definitely time to address some of this. And I would say I was genuinely surprised by how much I liked Star Wars Outlaws. The game went from, okay, that looks kind of interesting, to, yeah, I'll probably buy this one once it comes out. It's not perfect, but it certainly got enough right, and that coupled with the first open world Star Wars, I think will make this interesting for a lot of players. I have a feeling many Starfield or even quite a few Fallout fans will be interested in this one. So thanks again to Ubisoft for inviting me out for the hands-on, but with that in mind, if you're interested in a new Fallout game that you can play right now for free, check out this video.